Okay, lesson 3.4, cycles of matter. Cycles is the big word for 3.4. For the key questions for this chapter, how does matter move through the biosphere? How does water cycle through the biosphere? What is the importance of the main nutrient cycles? And how does nutrient availability relate to the primary productivity of an ecosystem? Before we go any further, I want you to pause this video for about 5 minutes, leave the slide up, and jot down some ideas about each one of these questions to see where your head is at right now. Okay, hopefully you've written down some good ideas and we can move on. First thing, let's look at the bare bones definition of what the book says for each one of these. So how does matter move through the biosphere? Matter, unlike energy, the one-way flow and the food webs, matter is recycled within between ecosystems as a cycle. Water also is a cycle. Water is continuously moving, this is a good word for water, continuously moving between oceans, atmospheres, land, and organisms. The nutrient cycles, there is 3 nutrient cycles, so that's going to make 4. We're worried about the water cycle, we're going to go into that one. And then there is the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles that we are worried about. Now, carbon should sound very familiar. Nitrogen, phosphorus also might sound very familiar. Nutrients, in the biological world, nutrients are the chemical substances that an organism needs to sustain life. Now, these are similar but different to the macromolecules. Up here, make up. And if you recall, macromolecules, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids, all living things need those to survive and sustain life. Lastly, nutrient limitation. So how does the nutrient availability relate to the primary productivity of an ecosystem? This one gets deep. If ample sunlight and water are available, the primary productivity of an ecosystem may be limited by the availability of nutrients. That is, if you've got enough sunlight and water to help make energy or help convert energy, then the availability of those nutrients to sustain life is what's going to control how well or poorly organisms do in the ecosystems. Okay? So, first one, we'll look at how matter moves through the biosphere. And we're not going to look at the one-way flow. We're going to look at how it's recycled through. Okay? If you look at this picture here, it's in your book. Essentially, you've got matter cycling, okay, and energy coming in and going out. All right, and that's how it works. We take an energy from the sun, we convert it, we use it, we give it off. However, matter cycles, and the matter is what actually makes us up, okay, and the elements. Break it down all the way to the chemicals. The elements that make us up. Remember, we go back to the chemistry of biology, where essentially humans are those macromolecules, which are made up of the carbon, nitrogens, and phosphorus. Okay? There's 4 things that we're really going to focus on here. 3 things. The biological, geological, and chemical processes. And those all get put into one word for biogeochemical processes. Okay? So the big thing here to think about is matter cycles, energy is used. Okay, the biogeochemical processes and humans. Let's go through each one of these. Okay. Biological processes consist of any and all activity performed by living organisms. So biological process, we'll put here living organisms. And we're going to go ahead and underline the things: eating, breathing, burning, okay? Eliminating waste. That's all stuff that living things do, and that contributes to the cycling through. The geological processes include volcanic eruptions, formation and breakdown of rock, and major movements of matter within and below the surface of the earth. So geological will say earth stuff. Just break it down in that way. We can underline volcanic eruptions, okay, major movements of matter, okay, and surface of earth. So it's the earth stuff. Chemical and physical processes include the formation of clouds, precipitation, the flow of water, and the action of lightning. So basically, I'm going to say the chemical environment. And hopefully you're kind of seeing how some of these are related, whereas maybe the biological processes can influence the chemical processes when we talk about formation of clouds, other pollutions. Okay, and then human activity fits into biological processes, but human activity is more stuff that humans are doing to change the face of the earth. So, like mining, burning fossil fuels with our cars or other energy-sucking things, clearing land, okay, for farming and anything else. Stuff that humans are doing to make our lives easier and more effective is also having an effect on the flow of matter throughout the ecosystems. Okay, so the water cycle. That's the first big cycle we're going to look at, which actually isn't matter, but it is water. So we're going to look how water is continuously moving between oceans and atmospheres and the land. All right. So this picture down here is the water cycle. I'm certain you've heard of this in middle school, and you might have learned a little bit. Now we're going to learn it even more depth and look at it and make sure you remember it. Okay. So basically, water enters the atmosphere through evaporation. Okay. And then it also comes from leaves of plants through transpiration. So I'm going to do a little flow here of evaporation and transpiration up. Now, transpiration, that's, like when you walk out in the morning and the grass is all dewy, where did that water on the grass come from? That actually came from inside the plants a lot of times. All right. Now, another way to remember transpiration, it's kind of like the plant sweating, and spiration kind of sounds like perspiration, which we all know humans do when they give off water or they give off liquid out of their body. So that's how you remember that transpiration is kind of like the plant perspiring. Okay? Now, when it's up in the atmosphere and it gets cooled down, there's condensation. It condenses into droplets that become clouds, and when the clouds become large enough and most massive, they precipitate. Okay, so evaporation, transpiration up, condensation, and then precipitation down. All right? So we're going to remember that cycle, and that is how water is just constantly flowing through. Okay? On land, when it precipitates, when precipitation flows, there's two different ways that it enters the ground. There's runoff, where it is essentially on top of the earth and then runs into a body of water, or it gets absorbed into the soil and becomes groundwater. And that's where a lot of plants get their water from, but then groundwater also flows through the ground and ends up in the streams and lakes and oceans as well. Big picture here, again, of the water cycle. So we want to label this where evaporation and here, condensation in the clouds, precipitation down, and then we have what we call runoff, and then groundwater down here. Okay. All right, nutrient cycles. So this is where we get to. We got the water cycle. That one's pretty easy. It's got 4 main parts. Nutrient cycles, we're going to go into each one of them. We're going to look at the carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus cycle by themselves. So let's start with the carbon cycle. Carbon, our favorite, most important element. It's in everything, and it is major in our energy and allowing us to do processes of life. If you guys remember these, carbohydrates, lipid, proteins, and nucleic acids all need carbon. All right? Carbon dioxide is also actually important in the exchange of oxygen in and out. We need oxygen in. When we use oxygen, we turn it into carbon dioxide so we can get it out, and then we can use a fuel for other living things on Earth, like plants that use. When we give the carbon dioxide out, plants use it during photosynthesis, and they help us making carbohydrates and oxygen, which are the 2 things we need. Okay, so it needs to be happening for us to survive and everything else like that. Without the carbon cycle and without carbon, there's no energy, there's no food, there's no carbohydrates, there's no oxygen. Each one of these, if you can see here, I'm going to star this here, each one of these colored arrows, and you might want to color them in on your slide because your slide is black and white. Each colored arrow is showing the different way. Also, in your book, on your iPad, if you look, there's some good, you can click on the figure, and you can click on parts of the figure, and it'll tell you more information about each one of these circles. Okay. When organisms die, decomposers break down the bodies, releasing the carbon into the environment. Remember, the decomposers are the ones that break down the Legos and help them get turned into something else. They are breaking down the carbon and the other essential nutrients back into the environment. Geological forces can turn accumulated carbon into carbon-containing rocks or fossil fuels. So the broken down carbon can actually be turned into rocks or fossil fuels, which we get a lot of our gas and oil from. Carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere by volcanic activity or human activity, such as the burning of fossil fuels and the clearing and burning of forests. So that's one way carbon is released into the atmosphere, is through carbon dioxide gas. And then it says here how much carbon moves through each pathway and how do ecosystems respond to changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. So think about that. How much is going through each pathway, and then how does an ecosystem have to balance itself depending on what happens. And this is a good time to think about the human activities of the fossil fuels and the clearing and burning. So hopefully you get the idea that carbon is a specific amount of carbon, and it's either up in the atmosphere as gas, or it's down on Earth in different organisms, or rocks. Okay? It's weird to think about that something can die, be decomposed, and then come back as a rock. It's possible though. Okay? So another big picture here. Carbon cycle is either atmospheric carbon or rocks or fossil fuels or in organisms using it. The nitrogen cycle. All organisms require nitrogen to make the amino acids, which are used to build proteins and nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. Nitrogen gas, N2, makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. Nitrogen-containing substances such as ammonia, nitrate ions, NO3, and nitrite ions, NO2, are found in soil, in the waste produced by many organisms, and in dead and decaying organic matter. Dissolved nitrogen exists in several forms in bodies of water. So the nitrogen. Now, we need nitrogen, proteins, This is why we need nitrogen. We need it for our proteins. We need it for our nucleic acids, which is our DNA. Now, a lot of think that the atmosphere is oxygen because that's what we breathe. But look at this. 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen gas. Interesting factoid there. Okay. So again, here are the different pathways, the biological pathways that cycle nitrogen, and then also the human and physical chemical. Okay. Bacteria convert nitrogen gas into ammonia. Nitrogen fixation occurs in soil and roots of legumes. These are like beans. Nitrogen fixation. That's a key word. Okay, and we're going to come to define that later. Other soil bacteria convert nitrogen, fixed nitrogen into nitrates and nitrites that primary producers can use. Consumers eat the producers and reuse nitrogen to make their own nitrogen-containing compounds. Now, nitrogen fixation is essentially, it's as a gas, okay? And nitrogen fixation allows it to be held onto. So, nitrogen goes from N2, the gas, and soil and roots of beans, nitrogen fixate, so it will stay where it is and not float away as a gas. This also happens in different bacteria as well, but there's some bacteria are nitrogen fixing. Okay, so that's important. So we kind of almost pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere when it's needed, and then it gets fixated, and then we can use it. Okay. Decomposers release nitrogen from waste and dead organisms as ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites that producers may take up again. So when we are broken down, decomposers, again, take our Legos, pull them apart. One of those Legos they're pulling off is the nitrogen, and then dead organisms can turn those into usable products again. Other soil bacteria obtain energy by converting nitrates into nitrogen gas. Well, if it's a gas, then it's released into the atmosphere. A small amount of nitrogen gas is converted to usable forms by lightning atmospheric nitrogen fixation. Humans add nitrogen to the biosphere through fertilizers. So, if you ever look at a fertilizer, nitrogen is one of the main macronutrients in a fertilizer, and that's what we put on our plants because it helps plants build strong roots and other strong parts so they can stand up and withstand environmental conditions. So we actually fix nitrogen into our fertilizers so we can give it to our plants so they can use it. Think about the algae lab. We put fertilizer in. If fertilizer is mainly nitrogen, what's that going to do to the algae? Okay, the phosphorus cycle, our last of the three big cycles. Okay, phosphorus forms a part of vital molecules such as DNA and RNA. Again, you need the nitrogen, and then you need the phosphorus for DNA and RNA. And as we get to that later, you aren't anything without your DNA and your RNA because those are the instruction manuals for all living things. All living things in this world, no matter how big or small, have a set of DNA and RNA, and that's what tells them what to do. Phosphorus is not abundant in the biosphere. It does not have an atmospheric form. So think about that. It's cycling, but does not go to the atmosphere. Okay? Phosphorus in the form of inorganic phosphate remains mostly on land, in the form of phosphate rock and soil minerals, and in the ocean as dissolved phosphate and phosphate sediments. So again, think about that. Something that organisms need inside their body for DNA and RNA spends most of its time as either rock and soil or as phosphate and dissolved phosphate and phosphate sediments in the water. Okay. Erosion is one way that phosphate is released. Some phosphate will stay on the land and cycles between organisms and soil. Plants bind phosphate into inorganic compounds when they absorb. Organic phosphate moves through the food web. Phosphate eventually makes its way to the ocean, where marine organisms process and incorporate into biological compounds. So there you go. All of these nutrients are essentially being sucked up by the plants from the ground, and then when the plants are eaten, that's how that gets into the consumers so that they can use it as well. Okay? So phosphate makes its way through the ocean into the marine organisms, or, as it says here, plants will bind phosphate into organic compounds when they absorb. Should be more there. Okay, when they absorb nutrients. Not sure what happened there. Okay? Again, check out your book, check out your text, and really click on each one of those parts and see how biological, human, and geological factors are part of this cycle. Okay? Oxygen, again, not one of the nutrients, but oxygen, just like water, cycles as well. And oxygen is kind of like the hitchhiker. It doesn't have its own cycle, but it's involved in all the other cycles in some way. It involves itself in the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles by combining with those molecules with the elements and cycling with them. Oxygen gas in the atmosphere is released by one of the most important of all biological activities, photosynthesis. Okay? And that also is how carbon dioxide is taken out. Okay? So CO2 in gives off oxygen. That's one way it's taken out. Okay? And then oxygen is used by all multicellular forms of life in respiration. Respiration is when we take in oxygen and we put it to action, and then when we use it, we give off CO2. Okay? So it participates itself especially in the carbon cycle, but oxygen is basically along for the ride in all these cycles as well. Okay, so I'm going to say oxygen is along for the ride. Okay, and the last question, how does nutrient availability relate to the primary productivity of an ecosystem? What's that mean? Basically, how does the amount of nutrients affect how well an ecosystem does? Okay, so think about that. If you've got plenty of sun, because sunlight is an abiotic factor that can influence ecosystems, pollution and water availability, those are all factors that can influence. But if you've got plenty of sunlight, plenty of water, now we're looking at which nutrients are available and how they affect the ecosystem. Okay. The growth of crop plants is typically limited by one or more nutrients that must be taken up by plants through their roots. Most fertilizers contain large amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Why not carbon? Micronutrients such as calcium, magnesium, sulfur, iron, manganese are necessary in relatively small amounts and can be limiting. So think about this. Why don't they need to take in carbon? Or why don't we need to put carbon in fertilizers? Hopefully, you're starting to think about where plants get their carbon. CO2 in. There's your carbon. Okay? So, we don't need to put carbon into plants because they take carbon out of the atmosphere. Now you've got macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then these micro ones which are available in small categories, but they're also very much needed. Oceans are nutrient poor compared to many land areas, which means they don't have a lot of nutrients in them. In saltwater environments, nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient. In freshwater environments, phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient. So the effects of that is if nitrogen is a limiting nutrient and you add a whole bunch in, the growth of the plants are going to be so much more. Again, think of our algae lab. Okay, sometimes the aquatic ecosystem receives a large input of a limiting nutrient, for example, runoff from heavily fertilized fields. The result of this runoff can be an algal bloom. An algal bloom can cover the water surface and disrupt the functioning of an ecosystem. So you might think, hey, it'd be good to add in more nutrients, but it's not always good. And an example is this algal bloom. It'd be great for the algae. They'd be living great. But then think about what that would do to the rest of the stuff in the ecosystem that needs that sunlight or needs that area that the algae is taking over. Okay, so I'm putting here increased nutrients is not always good. Okay? The ecosystems stay in balance. Okay. So, before next class, go back and watch this video a couple times, mark it up, but I want you to go back in your text and from this video, and I want you to answer these 7 questions to the best of your ability, and we're actually going to start class next time checking your markup and then talking about these questions and coming up with a solid answer for all of them from your guys' input. So you've got the video and your text. Go back, write these questions on a separate sheet of paper and put your answers under below them so we can talk about them later. Okay, thank you.